I could have your attention, I'd like to know, why are you all so happy? This is a time for gloom and doom in terms of what's going on in this country, in Great Britain, not to mention Ukraine and elsewhere. So, on that happy note as I begin, and I introduce you to the Irish side of my being, I want to thank you all for coming. This is a signature event for the Cohen Group. We've had the benefit of having Charlie Cook here for, I guess, the better part of 3 decades that he's been doing this for us, appearing every couple of years to try and distinguish what's noise, what's signal, where's the trend going, how tall is the red tide, is there any blue lakes out there, what's happening? And he's able to make that kind of analysis and give us some insight as to where we're heading. And it's more important, I think, this year, not to mention 2024, but this year is going to set a course for the next 2 years and beyond. And so what Charlie Cook's projections are, insights, et cetera, will be very helpful to all of us who deal with clients and in the press and other issues. I want to just take a moment to talk about our guests here today. We have guests from the embassies of UAE, Ukraine. Maybe stand up. Finland, Australia, again. Afghanistan, where are you? Okay. So welcome to this presentation. And we have the former Chief of Staff of the Clinton administration, Mack McLarty, who is here. I was told that Will Ball was going to be here. I didn't see him, so I guess he's not here. But if he wanders in, we'll acknowledge him when he comes here. We've got the former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, John Verino, from the great state of Maine, who's over there in Bob's table. We also, I should point out, Charlie Cook is a Mainer now. He lives in Harpswell, Maine, one of the most beautiful places on the coast anywhere in this country. So to get him down here is always a special treat. And I can only say, what's cooking, Charlie? Okay.
You know, it is just always just an honor to be with. I mean, I look around, it's like, first of all, just about every table, there's somebody I've known for at least 20 years, and some of them I even respect. No, I'm teasing, but but just so many people that have been just that are so important to making this system work. And but I appreciate y'all coming out. But thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Bob Tyre over there, who sort of helped facilitate all this. But it's a kind of a time where if you don't laugh, you'll cry, you know. And it's Mack McLarty and I were talking on the phone yesterday, and it's a time where next year I'll be the Maytag repairman, but now it's a little different. But what I want to do is talk in generalities for 5 minutes, and then just jump into the House, jump in the Senate, and then for whatever time's left, basically kind of fill in, maybe come up with some rationalization of what's going on and why it's going on, and then open it up for whatever y'all want to talk about. We're expecting a huge turnout in 19 days. And you'll remember that in 2018, that we had the midterm election turnout 104 years since 1914. And then 2 years later, we had the biggest election turnout in 120 years since 1900. And I think those elections, what really stood out is there were 2 kinds of people that turned out in really huge numbers. The people that loved Donald Trump and the people that hated Donald Trump. And they totaled about 95%, but anyway, of everyone. But it was just huge turnout from both sides. And I think that's what this is going to be about now, that it's going to be a big turnout from both parties, and that this election cycle, it started off like midterms usually do, with the party out of power really, really, really energized. Well, if you think about it, in midterm elections, 2 years in, the people that belong to a president's party are almost, they may be happy, they may be satisfied, they may be complacent, they may be a little disappointed, they may be deeply, but they're rarely just pumped up. I can't wait to vote. I mean, that just really, really, really happens. And then on the other side, you've got the people in the opposition party. They, in this time of intense partisanship, they hate that their side lost 2 years earlier. They hate everything that's happened in the last 2 years. They can't wait to vote. They're just spitting fire. And so they're highly motivated. The in-party usually isn't. And then you've got the people in the middle. Now, you think of, you do a national poll and you'll see, 30% say they're Republicans and 30% say they're Democrats and 40% claim to be independents, but we all know that 3/4 of them really aren't independent, that they lean and vote one way or the other. And so the reality is it's about 45% Republican, 45% Democrat, and 10% in the middle. And those people in the middle, they tend to be very fickle and they tend to get buyer's remorse. That whatever the heck it was that they expected they were going to get when they voted for the party that ended up winning 2 years ago, it's never what they expected or wanted or whatever. And so they have a very strong tendency to break against the party in power. And what seemed to be happening this time was that it looked absolutely according to the pattern, that Republicans couldn't wait to vote and Democrats were kind of down. I mean, the economy, all kinds of things going on, but they seemed really, really, really depressed. And it just looked like it was going to be a classic midterm. And it looked like, Democrats had the equivalent of a 50 to 75 mile an hour headwind. And it's not that anybody liked a tailwind, because nobody likes either party. So nobody's got a tailwind, but they had a big, 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 big headwind until you had the Dobbs Supreme Court decision. And that kind of put some starch in a lot of Democrats' shorts, and that particularly not just the Supreme Court decision, but sort of what happened next and next and next, the trigger laws and various legislatures coming back and putting in even, more restrictive abortion laws, that it closed the gap so that I think that Democrats still aren't quite as motivated as Republicans are, but it's pretty close. And actually, the Fox News poll that came out a couple of days ago showed it basically even in terms of intensity. And so you had that 50, 75 mile an hour headwind that Democrats had, and it kind of settled down. It almost appeared to go away briefly, to sort of the second half of the summer. And then it sort of got kind of picked back up. But one of the ways, one way of looking at it is, okay, this Republican side, Democratic side, is there was a spotlight. And the spotlight was just exclusively on the economy, inflation. Did the president, are they at fault for screwing up the economy? Rising crime rates, a little bit of immigration, some people thinking that the president, Democrats, overreached. Other people think they just overpromised and underdelivered, but it was a spotlight on all the problems Democrats had. And that Republicans were just sort of irrelevant. I mean, they were just going to be the beneficiary, Nobody was going to be voting for them. They'd just be voting against, and, of course, same result. But then after Dobbs, after gas dropped from, just over $5 a gallon to under $4, it's still high and much higher than a year ago, but it dropped down a good bit. Democrats had gone through a little period, a long dry spell legislatively in terms of accomplishments, and they got some things through. And so you had things that headwind went down a lot, but at the same time, you had the Dobbs decision, you had former President Trump becoming more and more visible and more talk about him running again. And so that spotlight kind of widened out to being a floodlight. And it was still illuminating the economy and President Biden and all the problems that Democrats were having, but it also was throwing some light at a lot of the issues that Republicans were, so that for a while it was just coming down as a complete choice. And if you're a Democrat and you've got, the kind of economic problems our country is facing, hey, a choice is a heck of a lot better than a referendum, that's for sure. But those headwinds kind of picked back up over the last 3 or 4 weeks. And things are not going to get back to where things were for Republicans 4 months ago, but it's not going to be where Democrats 4 weeks ago were hoping it would be. Okay, well, I tell you what, let me just move on. Let's just jump into the House, because I know this is the kind where people kind of want to go to the bottom line. First, just to reinforce, this is only the second, only 2 previous times in the last 100 years has the House been this close. And, and that was after 1930 and 1942. So, wow, this is really, really, really close. And a lot of people don't realize that when Republicans gained 13 seats in 2020 and Democrats lost 12, that difference was Governor Blanchard's state of Michigan. It's complicated. But anyway, when that happened, Democrats came within 32,000 votes of losing control of the House. And a lot of people don't realize, wow, 32,000 votes in 5 congressional districts from losing the House. And the Senate, remember, well, Democrats have these huge gains, right? And then suddenly it didn't happen. And I think what happened, just to back up and then jump into the House, what seemed to happen is after that presidential debate on September 29th, when President Trump did so badly, enthusiasm for Republicans just plummeted, and swing voters were shifting over towards Democrats. We had all this talk about the blue wave. And Democrats were going to, pick up huge numbers of Senate seats, and they were going to widen their majority in the House, and Biden was going to win easily. And all this blue wave talk started generating. And that 10% in the middle, a lot of them started getting some cold feet about this. I mean, wait a minute, what the heck does defund Will Ball? Now, this guy's a recidivist. He heard me less than a week and a half ago. Well, Will Slow, he's from Georgia. And anyway, where the hell was I? Oh, okay. And just start, well, what the heck is defund the police? And what does Medicare for All do to my private health insurance? And what is Green New Deal? And all these things. And these independents, true independents, started getting second thoughts about giving Democrats like everything. And somehow the blue wave turned into the Dead Sea in the last week or so. And it was not obvious at all that this was happening until actually the results started getting counted. And I think that in the end, that by a narrow margin, voters were ready to give Joe Biden the keys to the car, but not a full tank of gas and a credit card, that having, big majorities in the House and Senate would do. So, but there was that last gust of wind just kind of pushed things over, and we ended up with results that were just real different than what we expected. So in terms of the House, and the House really is, when they call it the House of Representatives, it's not misleading, because the House really is extremely representative of what's going on in the country. I mean, when you think about it, 4 and 35 districts, they were all elected at the same time, coast to coast, Mexican border, Canadian border, all up. And even though 4 and 35 are obviously not all competitive, but usually between 70 and 125 or so are competitive, and that's kind of a big enough sample spread around that whatever the prevailing mood is in the country, it's going to be reflected in the House of Representatives. And so you all have heard the statistics that 92% of the midterm elections since the start of the Civil War, the party in the White House has lost House seats. And it's the dynamic that I was talking about a little while ago. So, but the Senate is a different animal, but I'll talk about it in a minute. If you looking at the House, there are basically 100 out of 435. There are 193 districts that are either leaning, likely, or solidly Democrat, 193. And there are 211 that are leaning, likely, solid Republican. So that leaves 31 that are like really, really, really up for grabs. And so when I'm looking at saying, okay, what are the possibilities here? You know, one of the things I do as a kind of an exercise is I say, okay, first let's take those, in this case, 31 toss-ups. And okay, if Democrats won every single one of them, along with the 193 that are leaning likely or solid their way, they would get to 224. Wait a minute, that's a net gain of 2 seats if they won every single toss-up. Now, let's pull those toss-ups out of the Democrat column. Let's put them over in the Republican column. Where would that be? That would get Republicans up to 242, which would be a net gain of 29. And okay, so that if you're like drawing a bell curve, I think those are probably the 2 tails on that bell curve. Now, you might say, wait a minute. Giving every toss-up to one party, that's not realistic, is it? And it's logical to think that, except that in 2020, that's exactly what happened. Every single toss-up race that we had in the House, every single one of them went Republican. Every single one of them. Now, doesn't happen often, but when you've got that gust of wind that's strong enough, that can happen. I think so we've got Democrats up 2 to Republicans up 29. And more realistically, I think it's probably going to be in the 10 to 20 range. And now, you had Newt Gingrich, God love him, he was predicting 40 to 70 seat net gain for Republicans as far back as last November and as recently as July. And the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, was saying as many as 60. The highest number that we had, and David Wasserman is the House editor at the Cook Political Report, which I no longer own or run, but I still have a relationship with them, that Amy Walters is in charge now. But the highest numbers that David ever had, I mean, when things were really rock and rolling for Republicans, was 20 to 30, 20 to 35. That was his sort of high water mark. And the reason for that, as opposed to, the 52 seats that Republicans had in 1994 or the 63 in 2010, the reason they didn't get to these really big numbers is we have had now 3 decades in a row of redistricting, basically reducing down the number of competitive districts. So there are just more and more and more districts that are either just locked in on the Democratic side or locked in on the Republican side. So they're really just sort of not in play. And the other thing is that with Republicans having picked up 13, or let's put it differently, Democrats having lost 12 seats in 2020, there aren't that many things in life that are absolutely guaranteed. Death, taxes, on an airliner, the A seat's always going to be a window. And in politics, you can't lose a seat you already lost, And so because Democrats lost 12 of their seats in 2020, it takes, you can sort of lop 12 off the top. So we're now I'm at sort of 10 to 20 is the most likely. And, could it be 5 less? Could it be 5 more? Yeah, and it could obviously be further out, but, 10 to 20. So where would that put Republicans? 10 would give Republicans a majority that would be basically where Democrats are right now. And a 20-seat gain would be, a little bit wider, but not that impressive a majority. And by the way, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, Karl Rove wrote in the Wall Street Journal that he thought the number was closer to 20 than 25. So, you have to sort of separate cheerleaders from people that are looking at it, either kind of sort of, objectively, or they want to be protective of their credibility anyway, and particularly closer to the election, that becomes more and more important. But so 10 to 20. Now, for Kevin McCarthy, and I would put the odds of, I think 538, Nate Silver's got it at, basically like a 70%, give or take a point or two, likelihood. And I think that's probably about right. I differ a little bit with him on the Senate, but that's going to be in a couple minutes. But for Kevin McCarthy, obviously the bigger the Republican gains, the more secure he is in terms of taking over as, well, minority leader to a point, then speaker, but bigger the number, more secure he is. Now, there's some talk about, well, what happens if Republicans have a disappointing number? And you remember back in 1994, it was Gingrich's idea, 1998, it was Gingrich's idea to use impeachment to attack Democrats and attack President Clinton. And he pushed that sort of over the objections of quite a few Republican members, and it ended up being a big mistake, and he got tossed out. So a disappointed party, a party that doesn't get nearly what they want, they can throw people out, and they've been known to do that. But I don't think, and you hear about, is it Steve Scalise from my home state of Louisiana, or Patrick McHenry, or, there are a number of names out there. I think rather than what are the who might beat McCarthy, I think the better question, and just talking to Republican members, I get the impression is it's not who's going to beat him. It's what does he have to give up to make sure he wins, how much of his soul does he have to sell if this is not such a great time? And that's, it's, and not to question Kevin McCarthy's soul or anything, but, that's really more the question, and not a matter of who can beat him. But, so 70% chance, probably in the 10 to 20 seat net gain for Republicans would seem to be the most likely. But, again, with the caveat of the win, any gust of wind can really kind of change things. But in the Senate, as you know, this is only the second time since 1914, since we started direct electing senators, that the Senate has come in this close. Or I'm sorry, take that back. That it's only the second time that the Senate has come in evenly, a new Congress has started with the Senate evenly divided. So this, just as the House is really rare that's this close, it's really rare for the Senate to be this close. And we talked a little bit about the Democrats picked up their 49th seat, or they had been at 47. Then they picked up one seat in the November election, effectively basically Arizona. So they went from 47 to 48. And then they got their 49th and 50th seats in those two Georgia runoffs. Now, first of all, the fact that David Perdue, who was the elected incumbent that was up, you remember, under Georgia law, no other state does this, but you have to have 50% of the vote to get elected to the Senate, 50. And David Perdue got 49.7%. But that's not good enough, and so he was forced into a runoff, which, now, and I'm going to try to be equally mean to both sides. This is my Republican Trump side coming up in the next 30 seconds. Had then President Trump just acted after the November election, if he had just behaved like a 10-year-old instead of a 4-year-old, by attacking the Republican governor, attacking the Secretary of State, practically telling Republicans that their votes in Georgia that their votes hadn't counted. Republicans, they had won every single U.S. Senate race in the last 20 years in Georgia, and they would have won at least one, probably both of these. But because of what he did, they come up short. And Democrats pick up their 49th seat by a margin of fewer than 94,000 votes. And then they picked up their 50th seat so that Kamala Harris could break a tie by fewer than 55,000 votes. Now, spoiler alert, if the Senate if we come in with, coming out of this election, with Republicans at 50, Democrats at 49, you could very easily have another Georgia runoff. This time it'd be on December 6th. And because of that quirky Georgia law, there is a libertarian, just as there was last time, there is a libertarian on the ballot. That libertarian in 2020 got 2.3 percentage points, which in a close race, that can pull you under 50. And so watch, and with more of those coming out of the Republican side than the Democratic side, but anyway, watch for the possibility that we could have another Georgia runoff. So, but to kind of go through the math of where we are, basically each party has 45 Senate seats that are either not up or are just safe this time, 45. And so each side has 5 that are in varying degrees of jeopardy. And if you're going to just kind of bottom line it, I think it comes down to this. Which party wins 3 out of these 4? Nevada, the first 2 are Democratic-held seats. Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto, and her opponent's Adam Laxalt, who is the grandson of former Senator and former Governor Paul Laxalt and of Pete Domenici, long story. And Georgia with Raphael Warnock with Herschel Walker. So those would be the 2 Democratic ones in the foursome that I think are going to be decisive, and the Republican ones would be Ohio with J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan, who is probably the last moderate Democrat in the House, and he's leaving one way or the other. So, and obviously Pennsylvania with Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz against John Fetterman. So, to me, whoever wins 3 out of those 4 is probably going to be in control of the Senate. Now, there's some others that we're watching, and well, actually, let me just do these first. You can tell I have ADD, and believe it or not, I actually did take a Ritalin before I came over here. But that with Nevada, that is like as close as just straight Democrat-Republican race, where you don't have a Republican candidate in this race that is let's just say politically disfigured. Or my wife is trying to get me to stop using the term wacko, so I go with exotic and potentially problematic. But Adam Laxalt isn't like that, and so that's a straight up Democrat-Republican race. In Nevada, if your entire economy is basically built around tourism and gaming, the pandemic, economically speaking, they got hit harder than anybody else. And it's also a state where like over 40% of the voters in this election didn't live in the state the last time Senator Masto's name was on the ballot. And so they hardly know her from Adam. And so if they're mad about something, mad at administration, she will be more vulnerable than, just about any other incumbent out there. But, it's really, really close. End of the day, I kind of think that Senator Masto loses and that Laxalt wins, but it's a real close race. Georgia, people say, well, gosh, how could Herschel Walker win with all the... he's got more baggage than Samsonite, How can you possibly win with all this, Diddy did abortion, all these things? And I understand that argument. I really do. And I said exactly the same thing when the Billy Bush tapes came out, too. But, we're sort of at an era, and I'm going to, take shots at each side, but we're in an era where true partisans, they have blinders. They can put blinders on now. And that any transgression, anything bad about somebody from their side, they're just not going to choose to see it. And they'll pull the microscope out for anything on the other side, but we've now had more and more people, say a Democrat, there's not a Republican that they're going to vote for anymore. They're just hidden. And there are Republicans, even if Bill Cohen were running, well, okay, maybe, but... and there are Republicans that just aren't going to vote for any Democrat. Just not. And that's new. That wasn't the way things were 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that with Walker, you just sort of, Republicans just sort of, they seem to be, that widened out a little bit, and then it's kind of closed back up. And what's got to make Democrats nervous is when you can have this kind of stuff unloaded on your opponent, and it barely moves the needle at all, it's like, wow, I don't think this is about him or me. This is just, partisanship and what's going on in the economy and all of that. Now, for the 2 Republican ones with Ohio, it's sort of broken the hearts of Democrats so many times over the years, starting with 2004, when basically John Kerry was 119,000 votes short in Ohio of carrying that state, which would have sent the presidency going the Democrats' direction. And a state as big as Ohio, 119,000 isn't that big. But from that point on, it's just started to be just a heartbreaker for Democrats. And so the National Party really hasn't sent their candidate any money, even though the race is effectively dead even. And because they have been funding up, Michigan and North Carolina and not Michigan, Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and just have sort of chosen so far not to play there, which I kind of wonder about. And the problem, Ohio does vote 6 to 8 points more Republican than the country as a whole. And I think part of it is where Democrats are getting real resistance the last few years have been states that have disproportionate numbers of non-college whites or working class whites, and a disproportionate or a disproportionate number of voters that are in small town, rural, or smaller cities, because that's just becoming a no-fly zone for Democrats. Well, Ohio, you think of Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus, but man, there's a big share of that state that's small town, rural, smaller cities, and where Democrats are just getting a heck of a lot of resistance there. So a Republican shouldn't have a problem winning in Ohio. But if you've got a Republican that has, shall we say, a metabolism problem, those of you who are like me from the South might interpret it as being lazy, just not working real hard at fundraising, at campaign, whatever. And, I think it's fairly safe to say that Senator McConnell is not happy having to spend money in a state that he didn't think they ought to be having to spend a dime on. But, they see Ohio as kind of a firewall. And Ryan is running a really, really, really good campaign and is a really hard worker. And no question he's going to beat the point spread. The question, though, is can he win? But when you've got the natural advantages the Republican has and you can't pull away in Ohio, that's a sign that something there is going. Oh, and when Mike DeWine, the Republican governor, is, I saw one like 23, 24 points ahead. And, when you're running over 20 points ahead, your governor, or when you're running 20 points behind a governor of your own party, that's a sign that something's there. Now, Pennsylvania, and I should actually reinforce that these are my views, and my views only, not of the Cohen group, not of Secretary Cohen or Bob or DLA Piper or anybody. These are just me, okay? When people ask me, who do you think's going to win in Pennsylvania? And my answer is, Mac's laughing. I don't know who's going to win, but I know who's going to lose, the state of Pennsylvania. Because those are two really lousy choices. And the primary voters in Pennsylvania, each party picked their weakest candidate. And you just, wow, that's amazing to me. And that you'd had a moderate Democrat, Conor Lamb, who I think would have beaten Dr. Oz like a rented mule, as Dan Rather used to say. On the other hand, Dave McCormick, a private equity guy, if he had won the Republican nomination, he'd have beaten Fetterman just as badly, but each side went with their weaker candidate. And for me, it's not picking on Fetterman because of the stroke, even though there has been this is where Democrats actually have their blinders on. I'm not going to pay attention, despite the fact that, you may have somebody that's on the Senate floor that may not be able to understand what's being said, that sort of thing. Not to be mean, but the thing is, to me, the reason Fetterman was an exotic choice for Democrats was back in 2016, he was an early and big supporter of Bernie Sanders. Now, if you recall, Hillary Clinton carried the Democratic primary in Pennsylvania by about a dozen points, which suggests to me that that's not what the Democratic Party of as recently as 2016 would have done. But anyway, it's an example of how we have parties. Democratic parties have moved really far left, and Republican parties have moved really far right. And we're having all kinds of interesting people winning a lot of these primaries. And for Democrats, it's happened some. For Republicans this particular year, it's happening more, and kind of reminiscent of 2010 and 2012, where you had basically 5 cases between 2 elections that Republicans just, if they had nominated placebos, they would have won. But they nominated sub-placebos, shall we say, who didn't, and so they didn't get a majority in the Senate until 2014. Until 2000. Wait a second. 10. What was I talking about? I was talking about 10 and 12. So it's 2014 when Republicans eventually did get a majority in the Senate. Now, I'm thinking that it was these, whoever wins 3 out of these 4, but these are not the only ones out there, but I think they're the ones that are likely to be sort of the deal breakers out there. A couple of others, well, one, Mark Kelly in Arizona, and talk about a tipping point state. Boy, Arizona really is, but this is where Republicans nominated a exotic and problematic candidate. Another one is New Hampshire, which is a classic tipping point state. And had Republicans nominated Chuck Norris, the state Senate president, this race would have been 50-50, give or take 5%, But instead, they nominated a exotic and problematic, Don Bolduc, and so their chances of winning that seat, taking that seat from Democrats, go from, more or less 50 to more or less 20, And, big difference. The 2 other Democratic seats, just to keep an eye on, and if the political environment today, or on, I should say on November 8th, but I shouldn't because, a lot of people have already voted, and this is, the whole world's a little different. But that kind of political environment, Democrats would have needed to start worrying about losing some states that are a little friendlier to Democrats, a little or a lot, like Colorado, Michael Bennet. And this is a case where Republicans really did nominate a good candidate, but it's a state that does tilt, a fair amount Democrat. So I don't think Bennett's going to lose to Joe O'Dea. And then a couple notches even more over towards the Democratic side is Patty Murray, but Republicans really like their candidate Tiffany Smalley. But I just don't think the headwinds that Democrats have now are enough to pull under those 2 incumbents, given where their states are. On the Republican side, others that are pretty close, but I don't make it as sort of deal breakers. North Carolina, that open seat where Richard Burr is retiring, it's still pretty close. And Ted Budd is the Republican nominee congressman. Sherry Beasley, a former state Supreme Court justice, and she's done a pretty good job, pretty good job as a candidate. And North Carolina is definitely a tipping point state, but it's just been, Budd hasn't been able to put it away, but I do think he falls over the finish line by a couple of points. But that's one where Democrats definitely invested a heck of a lot of money there. And Wisconsin, Marco Rubio, I don't think Rubio's going to lose, but that race is closer than a lot of people think. And now Ron Johnson, Mandela Barnes is the lieutenant governor in Wisconsin. He has kept that race real close, but we're now starting to see Johnson starting to kind of pull away a little bit and put a little bit of distance between himself and Barnes. And there are 2 places where the crime ads and trying to resurface the defund the police have bitten Democrats pretty hard, and one was Wisconsin, and the other is North Carolina. And then we're kind of scratching our heads on Iowa with Chuck Grassley, and I forgot what. Does anybody here remember off the top of their head how old Grassley is? He's 80, 88. Thank you. I forgot. Iowa's a state that's moving, it has moved, it's moved towards Republicans in a really big way. If the Des Moines Register poll came out a few days ago that had the race having, really close, but I caution people, maybe it's true, maybe it's right, maybe it's not, but one poll doesn't make a trend. And, you want to see a pattern. But we're watching that, but it would be more about age rather than anything else. And I would be surprised to see Grassley lose. But we've all seen candidates who were getting up there and kind of overstaying their welcome a little bit that have been upset. So I'll go back to those 3 out of 4, and then let me just say a couple of things about 2024. and then we could kind of go whatever direction you want to do. But one thing that's not presidential, but about 2024, is that Democrats have some real exposure then. I mean, because there are like 8 Democratic Senate seats up in states that Donald Trump carried in 2020. And so they've got a disproportionate exposure there. So, to the extent that if they could get up to, 51 or 52, it may not be enough, but it would be a little bit, it would take a little bit of the edge off. But they've got to, let me put it differently. If I were Democrats, I would not get rid of the filibuster because it may become their new best friend. If they're in the minority, they're going to want that filibuster to there is a braking mechanism. But in terms of for the presidential, I'm convinced that President Biden, obviously, when you've run for president 3 times, and you get on the 3rd shot, and clearly, I would say that Biden has wanted to be president his entire adult life, except that my guess is it went well into before adolescence, maybe, that he's wanted to be president. That you don't give that up easily, but at the same time, we've all watched presidents age, young presidents age in that job. President Clinton certainly did, George W. Bush did, Barack Obama did. It's a tough job, and it's a tough job to take, when you're, at any age, but let alone when you're in your late 70s, or in this case, turning 80 on November 20th. But there's, people will say, well, but, President Clinton had a tough midterm election, and he turned it around and got reelected. That's true. And President Obama had a tough midterm election. He turned around. But the question is, does President Biden have the political dexterity that Clinton and Obama had? And or does he have it, or does he still have it? If and that's a hard one. That's a real hard one. But I think he sees himself, correctly or not, I'm the only Democrat that's ever beaten Donald Trump, and I'm the only one that could stop him. And so if Trump runs again, I got to stop him. And I think that's his thought process. And again, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I think that's the way he sees it, and sort of a factor to stick in the back of your mind. The second is, okay, what does Donald Trump do? And I was never particularly convinced that he enjoyed doing the job. I think he enjoyed more being president and some of the perks and things. But this guy that wasn't, he didn't devour 3-inch binders every night. Let's just say that. But what does he run, or not? And when does he decide? And one thing I'm convinced is that I don't see, let's say, if God told me today that Donald Trump was not going to run in 2024, I would bet you that we don't hear anytime soon. And you could get to March, April, heck, you might get to Memorial Day, and he might not. Now, someone will say, well, but gosh, that screws over your own party. Yeah, could. But that's not, he's never been a party guy. He wasn't a party guy when he was a Democrat. He wasn't a party guy when he was an independent. He wasn't not a party guy now. So I don't think he'd lose a lot of sleep over that. But I don't think he's going to walk out of the spotlight. I don't think that happens easily, even if I knew that he wasn't going to go. But to the extent that Biden's decision-making has impact on what Trump does, well, how does that impact? And, one thing is, okay, what does Ron DeSantis do? And I don't know if I've ever met him. I mean, he was a junior House member, and I don't know to be honest, I really don't know if I met him then. I know I haven't met him, since he's governor. And but I think he has done an amazing job of reverse engineering the Trump appeal. Is how do you replicate the Trump message, the Trump appeal, without Donald Trump's baggage? And I haven't seen any other Republican come close to doing it as well as he does. So, and he also doesn't seem to be intimidated at all about Donald Trump. So what I'm wondering is, kind of half expecting to see DeSantis, within hours or days of the midterm election, just saying, I'm in, and not waiting for Trump. Just get in and let the chips fall, and maybe he'll keep some other people out. Maybe Trump, knowing that he'd have to work for the nomination to win it, it might have an impact. But I think it makes a lot of sense for DeSantis just to go ahead and jump in soon. When I look at the Republican Party right now, I see of Republican primary voters, between 40 and 50%. I was saying 50, and now I'm thinking maybe that might be a little high, but anyway, bear with me. 40, 50% would jump off the Grand Canyon if Donald Trump asked them to. And they would either assume that he would have someone catch him, or that the experts are all wrong and it's really not very deep. But 40, 50% would do it. I think there are about 20% that are not going to vote for him under any set of circumstances. Now, 10% are never Trumpers, and they've never supported him. The 10% of them are probably people that voted for him twice and approved the job he was doing and agree with him on a lot of issues, but just sort of think, maybe this may not be a really good idea, to go with him. And they're just kind of over Trumpers. But that leaves 30 to 40% that are not locked in for Trump, but they're not locked in against him. And they're going to shop around, and they're going to decide how damaged merchandise is he, and who else is out there, what else is out there, and at least entertain the notion of jumping in. Now, two more thoughts on this. Because the Republican delegate selection process works differently than Democrats, Democrats have proportional representation, so you get, roughly speaking, the delegates of the share of the vote that you got in a primary, let's say. That's overly simplistic, but basically how it works. But Republicans are winner take all. So let's say you had 5 people running, and Donald Trump's one of them, and let's say he gets 40% of the vote, let's say, and somebody else gets 25, and then somebody else gets. That's basically, again, I'm oversimplifying, but that basically gets him all the delegates from that state. And there aren't that many states that he wouldn't have a heck of a chance of certainly having a plurality of the primary vote. And so I think he'd be hard to beat, but and then the final thought is, and again, I don't begin to be able to think like of what former President Trump, how he thinks and stuff, but if I were him, I would be focused on 3 things right now. Number 1, I want to stay out of jail. Number 2, I want to avoid bankruptcy. And number 3, I want to keep the family business together. I'm not a lawyer, a bunch of you are, but I think that's kind of a full-time job, actually, and that's what. But I don't begin to be able to understand, how he processes things. So he may well not look at that. And I know there's the argument that he can raise money to pay for legal things as long as he's a viable force politically, and I understand all of that. But at the end of the day, if I had to bet, I would bet that the Democratic nominee is not Joe Biden, and the Republican nominee is not going to be Donald Trump. But I don't think Vice President Harris is going to intimidate a lot of people out of the race if Biden doesn't go. So I'm expecting a real big field of Democrats running, and half of them would be people that sought the Democratic nomination in 2020, and then the other half would generally come from current and former governors. And Gavin Newsom and folks like that. So, but I think we're going to have. I think 2024 is going to be really, really, really interesting. And last thought before we open it up is that my wife calls me a pathological optimist, and I am kind of a sunny kind of guy, is my inclination. But I've never been more worried about the fragility of our institutions in our country right now. And I was the guy that would always roll my eyes whenever I'd hear somebody wringing their hands over the future of democracy and stuff. But I am kind of worried. And I do think that I don't think there's a silver bullet to fix the system. I think for the parties, it's when moderate, pragmatic, more centrist-oriented voters decide they want to take their party back over again, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, or preferably both. But I think there are some structural things, and I think, for example, the ranked choice voting, or Australian ballot. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but you know what? Give it a shot. Why not? I mean, it seems to be working in an interesting and I think maybe a positive way in Maine. And I think it would result in somewhat more moderate or people with broader base of support being able to win. But again, it's not a silver bullet. I mean, personally, I would ban all cable news, but I realize that's got some constitutional issues. We've gone through really ugly times before, and I've always thought that if God didn't smile upon the United States of America, we'd have been toast a long time ago. So I just wish he or she would hurry up. But anyway, so why don't we stop, and how do you want to do this?
Charlie, you only covered the 50 states. What about the other two?
The other two, I'm sitting there thinking, well, I mean, I know he's smarter than I am, and so I'm thinking, well, maybe, it's...
What if the unthinkable that Joe Biden doesn't finish out his term, and Kamala Harris is incumbent at that point? Would you still think there would be a what? I'm sorry, would you still think there would be a contest under those circumstances?
Ooh. Well, let me ask a very closely related question while I think of how I'm going to answer your question. That the last 4 sitting vice presidents that have sought their party's nomination, all 4, starting with Nixon in '60, all 4 of them won their nominations. Now, 3 out of 4 of them lost general elections, with George H.W. Bush in '88 as the one exception to that rule. But, it's really hard for a party to hold on to the White House after they've had 2 consecutive terms already. So some of that is just sort of the 8-year jinx that I think a lot of us probably didn't fully appreciate in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was running, that the time for a change, no matter what the circumstances are, would be there as well. Now, but if Harris is already there, let me, before I go there, if there is not a more important single demographic to me for the Democratic Party than African American women, because they still vote very, very, very Democratic, and they turn out at really good big margins, and that's a key group. And so you alienate that group. If you're going to run for a Democratic nomination, you alienate that group at some peril. But I don't think that would keep people out, but you might have a bunch of Democrats hold off and let a couple of other people have the honor of jumping in first, so that you don't get quite the heat on you that you would, as you're stepping in front of, someone potentially the first female president, or would, now in your case, where, the case of your question, would be. I think it would probably have to do with timing and what's the perception of how she's doing. And I, to me, she's kind of a mixed bag. I was underwhelmed when she was running for president. And then when Biden picked her, I thought for 3 months, I thought she actually did a really good job. And I remember thinking, God, where was her? Where was she? I mean, I thought she was performing at a much higher level than she had as a candidate. Now, then coming in as vice president, not so much, but, being vice president, that's really hard because do you run the risk of showing up your boss? There's a certain risk there. How do you calibrate that? And also the job inherently, it's not that great. I mean, I thought when the president gave her the border security, although technically it was actually dealing with South America, not the U.S.-Mexican border, technically speaking, but nobody really appreciates that. I got to think that she may have been thinking, gee, I thought he had forgiven me for that attack in the debate. I thought we were getting along fine, but apparently not. But talk about thankless job, being assigned anything related to border security, immigration, illegal immigration. Wow, that's a tough one. But it's a very, very, very hard job. But I think I get the impression she's challenging to work for, and goes through staff at a more rapid rate than a lot of other people do and have and whatever. So, I think I'd probably go with what's the timing, what are the circumstances? Had she handled the first few weeks, first month or two? I know I'm hedging like mad, but it's I will note that Pete Buttigieg is the most in-demand surrogate in the administration. And I do think that that's kind of a metric. And the other thing is that, to me, Buttigieg is ultimately, I think his biggest liability is not his orientation. It's the guy's a real centrist, and which I'm a dyed-in-the-wool centrist, but which I like. I love that. I think that's awesome. But that's not where Democratic primary voters are. And I remember listening to him at that big theater that's in downtown Portland, and it was like, wow, this guy's really, really moderate. He makes a lot of sense. And there's no way in hell Democrats are going to nominate somebody like that, or Republicans nominate somebody like that right now. But anyway, yes, sir.
Thank you, Charlie. Brilliant as always. First, a tongue-in-cheek comment and then a serious question. The tongue-in-cheek comment is that someone has suggested that maybe if someone would just give Herschel Walker an official Senate badge, he might be willing to go home. But the question is, obviously, whenever we're trying to prognosticate elections, it's all about the poll numbers. And my question is, what is the trend in terms of the reliability of polls, given cell phones versus landlines? Which kind of voter is willing to respond to a poll, and which of them are responding truthfully?
No, that's a great question. I don't think cell phones isn't in and of itself as big a problem, because now, in most polls, national polls, 75% of interviews are going to cell phones. So it's more caller ID, voicemail, and telemarketers burning people out that created the kind of resistance and let it go. Now, but the thing is, that had been increasing over time, but until 2016, the people that wouldn't pick up the phone and the people that did pick up the phone, there was no discernible difference in their political attitudes. And like in our household, if Lucy doesn't recognize a number, she just lets it roll over into voicemail. I'm the opposite. Now, maybe it's because I used to be a pollster, but if one of my kids is bleeding on the side of a road, and a Good Samaritan's calling, by gosh, I want to pick up the phone. And so, no, I may yell or scream and say ugly things to whoever's to a telemarketer, but I'm going to do that. But 2016 was the first time that there started being any evidence that there's some people that aren't getting called, or they're not picking up the phone, or they're not responding to an online interview, that something's going on. Now, I think that in 2016, I know it's going to sound like I'm rationalizing all that, but the polls were not as far off as most people think, And they'll say, well, gosh, the pollsters all said that Hillary Clinton was going to get elected president. Look at what the national polls showed. Yeah, look at what the national polls showed. They had her with a 3-point lead nationwide, and she won the national popular vote by 2.1 percentage points. Now, it never occurred to me that they were going to be any more accurate than that, but so that's sort of not. But they heard she's going to win the national popular vote, and they just sort of blew off the fact that this little technicality of an electoral college, which is done differently. And the difference, it's like going to a football game and watch total yardage gained instead of, say, the score. But most people don't make that distinction. Now, the thing is, there were some offs in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and I do think that even back in the 2016 primaries, Donald Trump pretty consistently overperformed in areas where you had a disproportionate share of working class whites, particularly those who had lost jobs in their area due to globalization, technology, automation, that sort of thing, that his appeal seemed to be a little bit turbocharged there. That's one. And two, and if you disagree with anything, Governor Blanchard, please let me know. The other thing is that Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania in 2016, they had three of the most restrictive sets of voter laws in the country in terms of early voting, absentee vote by mail, where it was basically in 16, it was basically all election day vote. And when nobody's voting early, and it's all, then that's anything that's happening in the last few days, last week or so, before the election is going to pop up more in a state where there's basically no early vote, wasn't then, so that I think there's a little bit of that. And I think there is some, this shy Trump voter, I think there is some of that. And the question is, how do you quantify it? How do you work around it? And pollsters, it's low trust voters that they don't want to share, they just don't want to participate. And they're not by definition Republican at all. They're not by definition Trump supporters, but they are disproportionately Trump supporters. And I mean, I think the reason why they feel that way and Donald Trump's attraction to them is, or why he's attracted to them, I think there's a linkage there. So bottom line is, I don't think that polls are as bad as most people think they are, but they're not as precise as some people think they are, or maybe than they used to be. So when I'm looking at poll averages where, let's say so-and-so's got a 2-point lead, a 2-point lead, let's see, like Laxalt's lead is 1.7 percentage points. J.D. Vance's is 2, Bud in North Carolina 2.5. I mean, you've got some really, really close races. Where's Georgia? Georgia 2.4. Yeah, Fetterman's. Then to me, that's close enough to have real doubt. And so I think people are presuming a greater level of precision than whether it ever was that precise, or maybe it's just not as precise anymore. So that's why I'm kind of being a little cautious. And also it was sort of the experience of in 2016 in the wee hours, about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, walking from the NBC studios in New York back to my hotel and thinking, I've spent my entire adult life studying something, and now I don't think I understand anything. It was kind of a professional existential threat. And so I've got more, a little bit more humility than I used to, and I think it's probably healthy, my business, to do that. But so making really clear delineations on a race that's like 2 points. I don't know. But that debate in Pennsylvania, though, coming up Wednesday night, I think that's going to be a big one because, and actually I should say that I think one of the reasons why things are as volatile as they are right now, is that you've got a lot of conflicted voters. You've got voters that are pretty upset with President Biden about the economy and about inflation, and they're really upset about that. But they may also be pretty upset about abortion. And abortion, I don't think abortion I don't think it changed minds of people that were going to vote Republican, now they're going to vote Democrat. I don't think it's that so much as just goosing up so that bringing the Democratic turnout closer to the Republican level. But there's some, or people that are a little bit unease about Donald Trump running again, getting elected again. And so both sides, you've got some, so what's going to be top of mind for them when they make their final decision, or when they made their final decision, if they voted a week or two ago, for example. And so, I'm not as sure of anything anymore.
You can do one more question, Charlie.
How about right over here?
Yeah, so in 2016, Democrats kind of aimed a little too high, trying to flip.
Okay, well, yeah, wait for the mic. Yeah, okay, good, because
I'm so sorry. So in 2016, Democrats kind of aimed a little high with North Carolina, but people are saying that the Senate race in North Carolina now is pretty competitive. Is there something that's changed, or is it the candidates, or are people just saying this again?
no, I think that there are states that are changing, and that Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, these are states that not that long ago there was little danger that a Democrat was going to carry them, in a presidential race or a Senate race or whatever. And as they become, like, let's say Georgia, North Carolina, as they become less Southern, with all these, people from other parts of the country, I'm trying to avoid the term Yankees, but coming in, as the states get more urban, suburban, and less small town rural, it's just gradually moving. Now, these things are not consistent. I mean, it typically zigzags a little bit, with the year making a difference, whether, one party's having a particularly good or bad year because of other things are going on, or having a stronger or weaker candidate. So I think those states really are trending, just as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are states that are getting more and more challenging. And Ohio, they've gotten more challenging for Democrats, and it's just the changing complexion of these states. Iowa Democrats, there's an excellent chance that there will not be a single Democrat in the Iowa delegation after this election, House or Senate. And wow, really? But so the states, they do evolve over time, and those are states that are evolving more. But is it enough? Is it changing enough and it was the narrowest state that Biden lost in 2020, but has it changed enough that having 40-year high inflation rates and being vulnerable to suggestions that they overstimulated the economy, that the rescue plan was too big, that state could be moving more and more purple, less and less red, but maybe not fast enough to interrupt what could be a kind of challenging political environment. But I do think, though, that in the Senate race, the House is just very parliamentary. It's, as I said, talked about being sensitive. The Senate is a lot more idiosyncratic, where individual races just matter a whole lot more, and that you could have a good political environment nationwide, and have the Senate go opposite direction, like 2018, for example. It depends on what's up, where are they up, and to quote Mitch McConnell, candidate quality can make a difference, and particularly if you've got some candidates that are very visible with flaws that are plainly seen, as opposed to sort of hidden back. So, no, I don't. There's no doubt in my mind that 5 years from now, North Carolina is going to be a tougher state for Republicans than it was 5 years ago. And same thing for Georgia and Arizona. All these places. But what the choices are and what's going on each specific year really does matter. But anyway, Secretary Cohen, I appreciate the invitation to come and to see all of you. And, I can hang out for a while. And, but anyway, the Cohen Group, gosh, what just a classy place, and DLA Piper as well. And anyway, it's an honor to be asked to stand before all of you. So thank you all very much for having me. Thanks, Bob.